From crowd-pleasing public executions to coldly calculated, terrifying sentences, here's how far the system and society are willing to go to ensure that child predators never victimize again. Today, we take a look at the most shocking executions of child predators, where the punishment was as appalling as their crimes. Wesley Allen Dodd. What if the justice system had to face someone who not only committed unspeakable crimes, but also took pride in them? Wesley Allen Dodd was one such predator. His crimes were beyond horrific, but what set him apart was how carefully he documented and relished in them. His first known murders took place in Vancouver on September 4, 1989, when he targeted two brothers, 11-year-old Cole Neer and 10-year-old William Neer. The boys were playing in a park when Dodd lured them into the woods. He bound them, sexually assaulted them, and then stabbed them to death. Dodd later wrote about the satisfaction he got from committing these heinous acts, showing no remorse for the young lives he had taken. The discovery of the boys' bodies led to an intense police investigation. However, Dodd managed to evade capture for weeks. During this time, he also meticulously documented his crimes, keeping clippings of the murders in a scrapbook. About a month after the Neer brothers' murders, Dodd struck again. On October 29, 1989, he abducted 4-year-old Leah Selly from a playground in Portland, Oregon. He took the boy back to his apartment, where he repeatedly molested him. Dodd kept the child overnight, photographing him and even taking him out in public to places like McDonald's before returning to abuse him further. The next morning, Dodd killed Isali by hanging him in a closet, once again documenting the horrific crime by taking photos of the boy's body. Dodd later confessed that he had kept the boy's underwear as a trophy, a disturbing detail that only added to the horror of his crimes. Isali's body was soon found near Vancouver Lake, which triggered a widespread manhunt for the killer. Dodd might have continued his spree had he not been caught trying to abduct another child. On November 13, 1989, Dodd attempted to kidnap a 6-year-old boy from a theater in Camas, Washington. Luckily, the boy fought back, causing enough commotion to alert bystanders. Dodd fled the scene, but his car broke down a few blocks away, allowing a man named William Ray Graves to catch up and physically detain him until the police arrived. Dodd's trial was quick, and he showed no desire to defend himself. He pleaded guilty to the charges and requested the death penalty, stating that he would kill again if given the chance. In a chilling statement, Dodd told the court that he believed he should be executed because he couldn't control his urges. Dodd's execution on January 5, 1993, was the first hanging in the United States in nearly 3 decades. The event was highly publicized, with media witnesses present at the Washington State Penitentiary. Dodd's final words before his execution were about finding peace through religion, but many questioned the sincerity of his last-minute conversion. Rifat and Khaled. In 2018, a particularly shocking case unfolded in Yemen that left the world stunned, not just because of the crime, but due to the brutal and public nature of the punishment that followed. According to the reports, 2 men, Wada Rifat, 28, and Mohammed Khaled, 31, in May 2018, abducted a 12-year-old boy named Mohammed Saad while he was playing near their home in the Al-Basatin district. Once inside, they sexually assaulted him. What made the crime even more horrifying was their method of silencing the victim. When the boy cried out for help, one of the men used a knife to fatally slit his throat. The details of the crime were widely circulated in Yemen, sparking outrage and calls for justice. Yemeni law, which permits capital punishment for serious offenses such as murder and rape, led to a swift conviction. The local court sentenced both men to death in a public execution, a form of punishment that has become a symbol of extreme justice in the region. The execution itself was brutal and meant to serve as a warning. Both men were marched at gunpoint to the execution site in the city of Aden, where they were forced to lie face down on the ground, their hands tied behind their backs. In front of the gathered crowd, soldiers fired AK-47 rifles into the backs of the convicts. The crowd, far from being disturbed by the violence, erupted into cheers, many capturing the moment on their phones. Interestingly, the execution of these pedophiles wasn't an isolated event in Yemen. The country, which ranks among the nations with the highest execution rates per capita, has a history of public executions for crimes involving children. These events are typically intended to send a powerful message to would-be offenders, demonstrating that crimes against children will not be tolerated. In addition to Rifat and Khaled, other accomplices were linked to the crime. A 33-year-old woman, said to be related to the men, was also implicated for helping them dispose of the boy's body. However, her execution was delayed due to her pregnancy. Arthur Gary Bishop. A former Eagle Scout and Mormon missionary, Arthur Gary Bishop's life seemed ordinary at first, but by the time he was in his late 20s, his dark urges emerged, leading him to become one of Utah's most notorious child predators during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Bishop's killing spree began in 1979, when he abducted 4-year-old Alonzo Daniels from outside his apartment complex. Luring Daniels into his home with candy, Bishop soon realized that the boy could tell on him, and out of fear of getting caught, he suffocated him. His second victim, 11-year-old Kim Peterson, was lured with promises of hunting and money. Bishop took him to a secluded spot, took photos of him, and shot him in the back, later dumping his body in the same place he had discarded Daniels. He confessed that, after the first murder, the barrier against killing was gone. He no longer viewed his victims as human, only as objects of his violent desires. Over the next few years, Bishop's victims included Danny Davis, a 4-year-old taken from a supermarket, and Troy Ward, a 6-year-old abducted on his birthday, and Graham Cunningham, a 13-year-old boy who would eventually lead to his capture as well. You see, Cunningham was one of Bishop's last victims, and it was his connection to another boy, Jeff, that tipped off investigators. Now, Jeff had been spending time with Bishop, who pretended to be a male role model after Jeff's father passed away. This relationship gave Bishop access to Jeff's friends. Bishop, using the alias Roger Downs, had been seen with Cunningham shortly before his disappearance. So, the police brought Bishop in for questioning under the pretext of discussing the disappearance. During interrogation, Bishop felt the pressure mounting and offered to show detectives something at his house. When police arrived at his home, they discovered over 300 photographs of young boys, many of them naked. During his trial in 1984, Bishop was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. His execution was carried out in 1988. Glenn Sullivan Sr. Arthur Gary Bishop's story is chilling, but what if the consequences for someone like him went even further than just a lengthy prison sentence? That's exactly what happened in Louisiana with Glenn Sullivan Sr., a convicted rapist. His case not only made headlines for the severity of his crime, but also for a highly unusual and controversial punishment. Glenn Sullivan Sr. was convicted of raping a 14-year-old girl. This wasn't just any horrific crime. It left the young girl pregnant, and DNA tests confirmed that Sullivan was the father. The evidence was overwhelming, and Sullivan didn't deny his role. His victim, despite being so young, showed remarkable bravery by coming forward, something that many victims of sexual crimes are often too terrified to do. Sullivan was offered a plea deal, 50 years in prison. However, the assistant district attorney, ADA, in Sullivan's case, wasn't just content with a long prison sentence. He wanted to make a statement, one that would send a message not just to Sullivan, but to anyone in the parish who might think about committing similar crimes. So, he added a stipulation to the deal: castration. In Louisiana, both chemical and physical castration are legal for certain sexual offenders. However, what made this case unique was that Sullivan didn't get to choose between the two options. His sentence specifically required physical castration, the more invasive and permanent option. When the news of Sullivan's sentence hit social media, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. People praised the decision, with many saying it couldn't happen fast enough. Some even suggested that the victim's family should have the right to carry out the castration themselves. The sentence required that Sullivan undergo physical castration before his release from prison. The Department of Corrections would be responsible for the procedure, just like any other surgery in the prison system. Although the sentence allowed for the castration to happen up to 1 week before Sullivan's release, there was a possibility it could happen much sooner. In fact, if the medical personnel deemed him ready, the procedure could be performed almost immediately. What does true evil look like in its final moments? From chilling confessions to disturbing courtroom antics, some of the most notorious child predators met their end in ways as dark and twisted as their crimes. Today, we're diving into it, the last disturbing moments of child predators who shocked the world. Joseph Edward Duncan III. Imagine walking into a busy Denny's restaurant on an ordinary morning, only to find one of the most wanted men in America quietly sitting in a booth with a little girl by his side. That's how Joseph Edward Duncan III was finally captured. But it wasn't a sting operation, a tactical raid, or even an anonymous tip that led to his arrest. It was the sharp eyes of an employee who recognized the only surviving victim of a horrifying spree that had shocked the nation. In May 2005, Duncan brutally murdered 3 members of the Growing family in their Idaho home. Using a hammer, he bludgeoned Brenda Groen, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and her son Slade, before abducting her two youngest children, 9-year-old Dylan and 8-year-old Shasta, and taking them deep into the woods of Montana. For over 7 weeks, he tortured the children in remote campsites, documenting his horrifying acts. Ultimately, Duncan shot Dylan in front of his sister, ending the boy's life in the most brutal manner. Duncan's crimes were chilling not only for their brutality, but for the way he evaded capture. Despite being a convicted sex offender with a long criminal history, he had managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system time and again. Before the Groen murders, Duncan was on the run after skipping bail for a prior charge. When police issued an Amber Alert for the missing children, they had no idea that Duncan had already crossed state lines with them. It wasn't until July 2nd, 2005, that the nightmare ended. A waitress at Denny's recognized Shasta from the widely circulated news reports and discreetly alerted her manager, who called the police. Officers quickly arrived, arresting Duncan without incident. Shasta was immediately taken to the hospital, where she was reunited with her father. Duncan's capture shocked the nation, but it was only the beginning of the horrifying revelations to come. During his time in custody, Duncan confessed to the Groen murders, the abduction, and Dylan's brutal death. But it didn't stop there. Investigators discovered evidence linking him to multiple unsolved cases across the country, including the abduction and murder of a 10-year-old boy in California in 1997. The videotapes of his crimes painted a picture of a man who thrived on sadistic pleasure. Facing death penalties in both Idaho and California, Duncan repeatedly tried to waive his right to appeal. In 2008, he was sentenced to death, but he would never see the inside of the execution chamber. Instead, in 2021, Duncan died of brain cancer at a federal prison hospital. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy's final moments were as twisted as his life had been. As he lay strapped to the execution table, moments before lethal injection, the infamous killer clown didn't plead for forgiveness, show remorse, or reflect on the lives he had taken. Instead, he turned to the executioners and spat out his last words, "Kiss my ass." Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. His childhood was troubled, marked by a strained relationship with his alcoholic and abusive father. In his early adulthood, Gacy married Marlyn Myers in 1964, and the couple had 2 children. Gacy managed 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises in Waterloo, Iowa, and was well regarded in the local community. However, dark urges lurked beneath this veneer of normalcy. In 1968, Gacy was convicted of sodomy after sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison but served only 18 months. His wife divorced him during his incarceration. Upon his release, Gacy moved back to Chicago, where he attempted to rebuild his life. He remarried in 1972 and bought a house in Norwood Park Township. Gacy also became involved in local politics, even taking a photo with First Lady Rosalind Carter. However, between 1972 and 1978, Gacy is believed to have murdered at least 33 boys and young men, often luring them with the promise of construction work or using his persona as Pogo the Clown, which he performed at local events. His victims were predominantly teenagers, whom he tortured, assaulted, and ultimately strangled to death. Gacy buried 29 of his victims in the crawl space under his house, while others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. Gacy's downfall came in December 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Peace disappeared after meeting Gacy to discuss a potential job. Police began investigating Gacy after learning he had been the last person to see Peace alive. Following a search of Gacy's home, authorities found human remains, leading to his arrest. In 1980, Gacy, being convicted of 33 counts of murder, was sentenced to death, but his execution was delayed due to various appeals. He spent years on death row, yet it seemed like he was never truly concerned about his fate. He passed his days creating eerie paintings of clowns. Even as his execution date approached, Gacy seemed more worried about lawsuits over the sale of his paintings than about his impending death. His last meal, bizarrely casual, consisted of a bucket of KFC fried chicken, French fries, shrimp, and a pound of strawberries, which he ate with his family while discussing the Chicago Cubs. But when the lethal injection began, something went wrong, just like Gacy's entire life. The chemicals didn't flow properly, delaying his death by 10 minutes. It was almost as if fate itself hesitated, mirroring the years of legal delays that had kept Gacy alive far longer than any of his victims. Richard Allen Davis. Richard Allen Davis's final courtroom moments were as chilling as they were calculated, designed to provoke outrage. As he stood to receive his death sentence in 1996, he made a wild and unfounded claim that further traumatized the victim family. Davis had been on trial for the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas, whom he kidnapped from a slumber party in October 1993. Despite national search efforts, it took 2 months before Davis was arrested, eventually confessing to the crime and leading authorities to Polly's body, buried in a shallow grave off Highway 101. What's even more infuriating is the fact that at the time of Polly's kidnapping, Davis had only recently been released on parole after serving only half of a 16-year sentence for another kidnapping. Throughout the trial, Davis showed little remorse, frequently lashing out at the court, making obscene gestures at the cameras, and attempting to manipulate the narrative of the case. He even stated that Polly had begged him not to harm her, like her dad did, implying that she had been abused by her father. This baseless accusation caused an uproar in the courtroom, with Polly's father, Mark Klaas, attempting to lunge at Davis before being restrained. Davis's cold demeanor made it easier for the judge to confirm his death sentence, and despite numerous appeals, including one where Davis argued that his confession was obtained without an attorney present, his death sentence was upheld in 2009. In 2006, Davis was found unconscious in his prison cell after an overdose on opiates. Though authorities determined it was not a suicide attempt, he was revived and returned to San Quentin, where he remains on death row to this day. Angel Maturino Resendiz. Angel Maturino Resendiz, known as the Railroad Killer, unlike most death row inmates, refused the tradition of a last meal, and his final words carried a weight of regret and confession. As the lethal injection drugs coursed through his veins, he asked for forgiveness, acknowledging that he had allowed the devil to rule his life. Resendiz's was essentially a drifter who used the vast American railroad system to travel across states. Small towns and quiet homes near railroad lines became his hunting ground, and he would often rob and sexually assault his victims before moving on. From the late 1980s until his capture in 1999, Resendiz left a trail of terror across the United States, from Texas to Kentucky, Illinois, Georgia, and even Florida. One of his most notorious murders was that of Dr. Claudia Benton, a pediatric neurologist in Houston, Texas. On December 17, 1998, while she was asleep after a long day of preparing a presentation, Resendiz broke into her home near the railroad tracks. He brutally assaulted her, stabbing her with a kitchen knife and bludgeoning her with a bronze statue. Resendiz also sexually assaulted her before stealing valuables and her car, which he used to flee the scene. The discovery of Benton's stolen Jeep in San Antonio led investigators to a crucial piece of evidence: fingerprints inside the vehicle that matched Resendiz, who was already using several aliases to evade capture. But Resendiz wasn't new to such brutality. His violent tendencies surfaced long before, dating back to his early life in both the United States and Mexico. Before Benton's murder, he had been arrested and deported multiple times, only to return and continue his killing spree. Though Resendiz's list of victims is long and gruesome, one survivor managed to escape his grasp: Holly Dunn. She and her boyfriend, Christopher Meyer, were attacked by Resendiz in 1997 while walking near railroad tracks in Kentucky. Dunn's boyfriend didn't survive. Resendiz bludgeoned him with a rock, then turned on Dunn, assaulting and beating her. Miraculously, she survived the ordeal, and later played a key role in securing Resendiz's death sentence with her powerful testimony. Surprisingly, it was Resendiz's own family who ultimately brought him to justice. After years of evading the law, his sister, Manuela, recognized the danger her brother posed, not only to others, but to himself. She negotiated his surrender with law enforcement, and in July 1999, Resendiz turned himself in at the U.S.-Mexico border. Despite attempts by his defense to claim insanity, Resendiz was sentenced to death, and 6 years later, on a stifling June night in 2006, he faced his execution. As he lay on the gurney, his voice trembled with what seemed like a mixture of fear and regret. He asked for forgiveness. However, his last-minute pleas did little to soothe the anguish of the families of his 16 victims, whose lives had been violently cut short. For them, his final words were too little, too late. If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into similar content, go ahead and click on the videos displayed on your screen right now. Each one offers more captivating stories and insights that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.